Hey, you! Yes, you! Do you feel this deep emptiness inside because it's been centuries since you last smashed some church windows? Are you succumbing to despondency because it's been ages since you last decapitated a marble statue or defaced some religious art with your hatchet? Fear not, fellow iconoclast, because I'm here to help you, and today we're going after the cult of Saint John of Oxford. Cheers! Welcome back to my channel where we talk about books and other things, and today we are going to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien, Middle-earth, and what's wrong with all of it. Something that will definitely not get any backlash, I'm sure, so go ahead and tell me all the lovely things you want to tell me and how great all of this was in the comments. Or yell at me. I'm fine with that too, as long as you do something. Like, subscribe, do all these things as well. I appreciate it. And with that, let's look at the program for today. All right, so there are three issues that I have. I have more, but these are the three that we're going to look at closer today. And these are, when we talk about fantasy literature, still today, in the year 2023 of our Lord, a lot of people share the opinion that the greatest fantasy writer that ever lived was J.R.R. Tolkien. There's also a lot of people who still believe that Tolkien single-handedly invented the fantasy genre. Now, we know that's not true, for a lot of reasons, but a lot of people still believe that. That's one part of it. Then there is a second part. If you try to point out that some things written in Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or even the Silmarillion are maybe not up to snuff when it comes to gender representation, the look at different ethnicities and races and so forth, a lot of people will fall over themselves to attack you. How can you even dream of suggesting that Tolkien is not perfect and a genius? It is tantamount to lèse-majesté in their eyes, and we need to understand that we should never ever criticize Tolkien. On the other hand, and this is the third part, if in, say, adaptations, people are slowly changing things to go with the times, so to speak, and have maybe not a fully white cast or something like that, they'll get attacked for, well, blasphemy and wokeism, and how dare they changing gospel of Saint John of Oxford, and a lot of other things down that road. And I believe those three things are connected to one specific issue. That issue is what I call the cult of Tolkien, or the Tolkien cult. And that is the specific way that Tolkien's work and heritage have been shaped by people into something that goes beyond the way we look at other fantasy, or even other authors in general. And that's what I want to look at today, and maybe take it down a bit, sort of, maybe. So, how are we going to do this? Well, first, I need to acknowledge that yes, Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings in particular has a very specific role in the history of fantasy. It is still probably the one thing that most people think of when they hear the word fantasy. Or at least the one thing they will admit to having heard when they hear the word fantasy. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Tolkien's work is pretty good. I have read The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion more than a dozen times each. I have read his other stories, Smith, Upwood and Major, and Farmer Giles of Ham, and Leaf by Niggle, and I do love those as well. I've even read the stories and tales of Tom Bombadil several times, because I like Tolkien stuff. I do, really. But that's it. There's something going on here that goes beyond that. So, what we need to do today is to show that while there is a very powerful role and a very influential role for the works of J.R.R. Tolkien in the history of fantasy, those may just have been there for reasons outside of Tolkien's personal genius. Because what I've tried to show so far is that there is that belief that Tolkien was uniquely gifted as a person, as a writer, and that his work is, for some ineffable reason, more powerful, better, of higher quality, of something else that gave it that extraordinary position in the history of fantasy. Now, obviously, claims that, he invented fantasy are easily disproved. That's not so much the problem here. The problem is to show how the Tolkien cult ended up in the position that it is in today, and how those reasons are not necessarily because of the quality of Tolkien's writing or his personality. And I will do that with three main arguments. A first one is about the history of the books. The second one is about its reception in academic circles. And the third one is about Tolkien's estate and Tolkien's heritage. And after that, I hope to have shown that while there is a lot of very interesting things going on, Tolkien's mostly not to blame for them, so maybe we should actually move on. Alright, let's start with the history. As I said, The Lord of the Rings in specific, also The Hobbit slightly less, and The Silmarillion far less, Middle-earth in general, are very popular. They are still the #1 work of fantasy that people remember when they hear the word. Tolkien was, in the words of Tom Shippey, the author of the century. Well, that century being the 20th century, of course. They're big, not only in Japan. So the question is, how did they end up there? And that's the first argument here. See, J.R. Tolkien published The Hobbit in 1937 and published The Lord of the Rings between 1954 and 1956. At the same time, a lot of other fantasy books were written. Mervyn Peake published his first Gormenghast novel. T.H. White published the Once and Future King Arthur novels. Poul Anderson published Three Hearts and Three Lions and The Broken Sword. And to the everlasting regret of Michael Moorcock, he did not become the godfather of fantasy, but Tolkien became that. So the question is, why? And I would argue that there is one major reason, and the other one comes later because of that. See, we need to talk about piracy for a moment. And I don't mean the Corsairs of Umbar, I mean ace books from the United States. In the 60s, 1965 to be specific, ace books found a loophole in copyright law, or so they thought, and released a non-official paperback version of The Lord of the Rings. They found out that even the pages for the books that were sold in the US at the time were printed in the UK and then sent to the US, which meant that the book had never been printed in the US and was thus not covered by US copyright law at the time. So they just pirated the book and sold it very cheap for 75 cents, which I have no idea what it is nowadays, but it's still very cheap. And that was really cool. Obviously, there was a bit of a, stir around that. Tolkien made some small changes and revisions. There was a second edition of the text, which was then officially published in paperback by Ballantine Books a year later. And after a bit of a lawsuit and so forth, the ace books went out of print. But the damage, or, well, not exactly the damage, had been done. That is, a lot of Lord of the Rings books were suddenly available in the US, fairly cheaply, and a lot of people had suddenly heard about Lord of the Rings. So they read those books. And this is why this is a bit of a perfect storm there, this is the late 60s. Counterculture, hippies, all these kind of people smoking drugs, having free love, and all these things that Tolkien will never ever talk about, but also being not exactly happy with war in, say, Vietnam, or, well, apparently in Gondor. Also, feeling that we may be destroying our planet. As it turns out, they were right about both. But Tolkien's work, Lord of the Rings in particular, is, well, it's very anti-modern, but it's also very much, it has a lot of imagery and ideas about environmental destruction and the ills of modern life in a lot of ways. The mechanized warfare, things like that are not exactly Tolkien's favorite subjects. They show up, they are condemned, and, well, nature is very much a main character in The Lord of the Rings, and that connected with a lot of people in the counterculture movement. who had just bought these illegal paperbacks for 75 cents. And while smoking all their weed, they read these books and were like, whoa, talking trees, or something like that. So, yeah, Lord of the Rings became very powerfully popular in a group of people that then went on to create culture. They wrote songs, they became writers themselves, they became, well, musicians, artists of all stripes. Even Led Zeppelin started writing songs about Lord of the Rings, other musicians as well. They carried the call of Lord of the Rings, of Tolkien, of Middle-earth, into the entire world out there. It gave Lord of the Rings a boost that other fantasy books had not had. And once again, be aware, this is about a decade after the books were actually published, and no one really much cared about it, except, people like Gene Wolfe, who had to go to extraordinary lengths to actually get those books in the US, as you can find in his wonderful essay on the Best Introduction to the Mountains, which you should go and read. So there's the first big boost for, Tolkien's legacy, or Lord of the Rings becoming the major idea of fantasy, the major concept of fantasy, the most successful fantasy book. The second bit comes with Ballantine books. See, after the success of the Lord of the Rings paperbacks, Ballantine decided to publish more fantasy. Makes sense, right? So what they did is go and publish a lot of older fantasy that was originally published before Tolkien started writing. Worm Ouroboros, A Voyage to Arcturus, Blood in the Mist, stuff like that. William Morris, possibly even Lord Dunsany. Those kind of texts. And when they ran out of those books, they actually paid writers to write new fantasy. Obviously, they were looking for stuff that was sort of in the vein of Lord of the Rings, so they can sell it to people who wanted more books about bumbling rural farmers getting into trouble with the Dark Lord and coming out ahead, because that's what they thought Lord of the Rings was all about, which is only partly right. However, one of the first people who actually got published in Ballantine paperback that way was Terry Brooks and the Sword of Shannara. And from that point onwards, we have very much the series of what Farah Mendelssohn calls the Tolkienistas, people that emulate Tolkien without fully understanding him and being sold in large quantities. Which, still always echoed Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's name in everyone's mind. So that's the first big boost for Tolkien's reputation and the Lord of the Rings as the work of fantasy of the 20th century. Now, is that because of its brilliance? Or is it because of, someone exploiting copyright law and there also being bits about nature being pretty cool at the right time? I would argue the latter. The next big boost comes with the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the new millennium and the movies. See, the Lord of the Rings movies have had a huge impact on a lot of people. Right now, a lot of people obviously have these images from the Peter Jackson movies in their head. When they hear fantasy, that's what they believe. That's what they think. They have been extremely powerful. They are well made. That's not my point here. My point is that for all kinds of reasons, once again, including copyright and licensing laws and stuff like that, if you want to have a really good impact, look at the long folding ideas video on Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings movie to get an image of what was going on. It took a while to get everything straightened out, and to have the right technology to produce a huge 3-part fantasy epos that looked, modern in a lot of ways. In fact, Lord of the Rings is sort of the first big screen fantasy spectacle since Star Wars. That's almost, 20 years, more than 20 years almost. And that did basically start a new era of fantasy. But is it because Lord of the Rings is so good? Is it because these movies are so good? Or is it because we're kind of starved for something, and should people have decided to, film a Wheel of Time movie instead? Wheel of Time would have taken that. I personally don't know. I think it's a combination of all of these things, but certainly being the first major production with modern visuals and so forth did boost Lord of the Rings far beyond the mere quality of the writing, is my argument here. Anyway, that's my first strand of my examination, the popularity of Lord of the Rings being somewhat reliant on circumstances out of anyone's control. Part 2. Academic respectability. All right, for the longest time, people in literary studies have scoffed at fantasy. They have looked down at fantasy. Parents have looked down at fantasy their children read. We all have gone through that. It's like, what are you reading? Oh, isn't that for children? Oh, you're just reading fantasy? That's not serious. We know that, right? And that's something that a lot of people have suffered from, but not Tolkien. Lord of the Rings may be the only modern fantasy series or fantasy books that have a modicum of academic respect. Still not necessarily in literary studies, but in all kinds of other places. There is, in fact, almost a discipline of its own called Tolkien studies, if you want to call it that. They have their own conferences, their own magazines, so forth. The question is, how did that happen? Is it because of the quality of Tolkien's writing? Or is it because of something else? My argument is it's because of something else, and it's about Tolkien's world building and Tolkien's method. See, Tolkien himself was an academic. We all know that. He's a professor and so forth. He's a linguist. He was a linguist. And he approached his writing with his knowledge, with his academic background in Old English, Old Norse literature, medieval literature, and philology. And that's great. But something else happened there. People with a similar background to Tolkien could use his books and examine them with their academic lenses. When you look at the people that are writing academic papers on Tolkien, a lot of these people are medievalists. They are professors in Old Norse, in Anglo-Saxon literature, medieval literature, that kind of stuff. They are not literary scholars. They are all kinds of other academics. And the reason for that is that A, they can, well, use their skills and look at Tolkien, which, you know, is really good if you're part of a discipline that has generally always taken very far, you know, been far in the back of the mind of a lot of people and so forth, because you can make it popular. It's like, hey, look, we may be talking about Beowulf, but we're also talking about Tolkien. Isn't that fun? So it helps these kind of disciplines to gain some prestige, and in the other way around, it helps Tolkien's works to gain some prestige. The other part is that, of course, because of Tolkien's way of producing, inventing languages, the way of, you know, rewriting and writing and rewriting tales, they are open to, you know, the way that, say, medievalists look at manuscripts. Critical editions of Tolkien's writings are possible, and you can use the same tools that you would use as a historian. All in all, what I'm saying is that Tolkien's works gained academic prestige by being accessible to people outside of literary studies, because these people had nothing to fear. They were not ostracized for looking at Tolkien because they never were part of that literary fiction elite. They were other people. The main authority on Tolkien nowadays, Professor Tom Shippey, is actually, well, has the same chair at Oxford that Tolkien had on medieval and Old English literature, not on contemporary literature or anything of the sorts. And I feel that's part of it. So Tolkien's works gained academic prestige by being accessible to academics outside of literary studies. And on the other hand, all us, you know, fantasy fans out here desperately trying to prove that the stuff that we're reading is in fact worth reading and is cool and is just as serious and, you know, complicated, complex, and worth reading as anything else, if not more so. We were happy to snap that up. It's like, look, there's academic books and papers by people with titles, like with PhDs and professors, you know, on our fantasy books. So it must be worth something. It must be serious literature, right? So we had that dynamic going on here. But once again, is that because of the quality of Tolkien's writing? Well, to a part, it certainly is. But most of it is about world building. It's about language building, picking out names, stuff like that. It's not so much about the literary quality of Tolkien's writing in a lot of this stuff. So once again, is it because Lord of the Rings is a better fantasy book than anything else, or is it because Tolkien was actually an academic himself? I would argue it's mostly because of the latter. So this is part 2 of my argument. Now let's look at the third part, the actual cult building, or Tolkien's heritage. See, when authors die, there's always a question what happens with their estate, with all their papers and so forth. A lot of them already donate them to some library or something like that. Sometimes there are, children, surviving, family that squabble over it and so forth. And sometimes one person becomes the main person to keep an eye on the heritage of an author. In the case of, say, H.P. Lovecraft, that was obviously August Derleth, who did actually change a lot of things about the Cthulhu mythos and the way we more normally imagine it. To the worse, I might add. Although he did certainly smooth some of the more racist and anti-Semitic edges of the cult as well. My point is, Tolkien was lucky in that regard, because Tolkien had a son, Christopher Tolkien, who did take over all of that Middle-earth work. He edited the Silmarillion with the help of Guy Gavriel Kay. He published The Unfinished Tales. He published a 12-volume critical edition, The History of Middle-earth, and then he did other editions of individual tales in his later years, those being obviously The Children of Húrin, The Fall of Gondolin, and Beren and Luthien, and all of these are excellent. But, and this is where we come to the cult thing again, Christopher Tolkien was Tolkien's son. And that meant he had privileged access, or could at least make a call to privileged access to knowledge. And we find that in his texts. See, a lot of these books later on have notes by Christopher, and they usually say, and my father did this, and my father did that. I remember my father saying this in the year so-and-so, which will give Christopher Tolkien, or gave Christopher Tolkien, an authority over the correct interpretation of Middle-earth lore that goes beyond what any other scholar could ever muster, because there is that personal connection. It also, ties in those interpretations, ties Tolkien's name into all these versions. It's not just like we have 10 different books. This is what I believe my father said, and that makes it very difficult to separate between the art and the artist in these later documents. It makes it very difficult to do the full-on death of the author. And that's what we need to look at here. See, we have one major inheritor of Tolkien's powers, the high priest, so to speak, just in the same way that, say, the popes are the representatives of, or, the heirs of St. Peter, and gain some authority just through that. So Christopher Tolkien gained authority just through being J.R.R. Tolkien's son, and giving his interpretation, well, authority over other interpretations of different texts, in a way. All the way linking, further entwining Tolkien's name, J.R.R. Tolkien's name, with these interpretations through notes and so forth, where it's very difficult to say, well, this is just the text that we have, because it's the text that we have as edited by his son with notes that say, my father said this to me. And that makes it very difficult to do that. And that's where we are ending up with the third argument here, why Tolkien's reputation, or the Tolkien cult, is different from other authors' legacies. Because at the end of the day, Tolkien's work did not end with Tolkien's death, but it continued with the books being published by his son. And that meant that we kept having a monolithic canon of what is the correct way of reading Tolkien through these further releases, these further publications, through his son being there and being something of an authority beyond just another scholar. All of that kept Tolkien's heritage going a long time on, which, bolstered by academics doing work, Tolkien also, to Christopher Tolkien, built this whole idea of almost like a church, where you have a main person, the Pope, so to speak, the high priest, but you also have religious or Tolkien scholars around it, looking at books, giving their interpretations, their views, and so forth, creating this machine that could theoretically keep going and going and going, and giving us orthodoxy in the way of how to read Middle-earth and how to deal with Middle-earth. And while Catholic Tolkien might have been very pleased with that idea, I personally doubt it. So this is my argument why there is a Tolkien cult, and that none of this has, or very little of that has to do with the quality of Tolkien's writing, and a lot of it with, well, circumstantial events and luck. Well, I'm not saying that these books are bad. Once again, I love them. I'm saying that there is a very specific circumstance that made criticizing Tolkien so difficult. And this is where we'll need to talk about mythology and death of the author and authorial intent. See, when we talk about what is in a book, there's two major ideas of how to read books, right? There is authorial intent, which asks, what did the author actually want? And then there is death of the author, which says, fuck the author, you're the reader, you have to do this. You have to do all the heavy lifting. Get out of it what you can. Now, both of these are obviously valid approaches, and in most cases, I think we usually fall somewhere in between. However, and this is where we find the difficulty, authorial intent, once you have a very specific quote of an author, is a very good argument for your case. If you have a very specific reading of a book, you go like, well, but the author also said this. Then that may be a good argument. If you want to prove that there are no dark-skinned elves in Lord of the Rings, or no black dwarves in Lord of the Rings in Middle-earth, and you can find a quote of Tolkien saying that, or something of the sorts, you have an argument there, which will, give authorial intent more weight in any of these discussions. And because of the very specific, huge image that J.R.R. Tolkien threw these events that I just talked about, and the high priesthood of his son, flanked by all these interpreters and Tolkien scholars that are focusing on Tolkien's writings and not on the overall discourse of fantasy in general, have lent to that authority. You can always have recourse to Tolkien, to that religious canon there, almost like, how dare you change orthodoxy? How can you even think about criticizing St. John of Oxford, the godfather of fantasy? How dare you? Which makes discourse in that regard very difficult. Now, this is the problem, and I've tried to show why it is wrong. Now let's do 2 or 3 small things before we end this. Part 1. Tolkien didn't want that. I'm not doing authorial intent. I'm just pointing out a few things here. See, fantasy, contemporary, modern fantasy has been around since the 18th or 19th century, depending on where you start. If you think you start with, like, say, the Gothic novels, you're like, it's the 18th century. If you look at, German Kunstmärchen and what follows in, like, the English tradition with people like George MacDonald and so forth, you're like, it's the 19th century. It's been around for a long time, and Tolkien was aware of that. Tolkien read these authors. He liked a lot of these authors, and him and his friend C.S. Lewis decided to write more of those stories, which they called science fiction, because they wanted to have more of these stories. And they made a deal, and C.S. Lewis had to write science fiction stories about space, and Tolkien about time. C.S. Lewis wrote Out of the Silent Planet and the whole trilogy. Tolkien started a time travel, or at least memory, recall, rebirth, whatever story that never got published, but that's where the whole story started. So Tolkien himself saw himself as part of that tradition, just by what he was doing, writing, fantasy or science fiction, because he loved that genre. So that's the first part here. The other part is that art has obviously always been a discourse between artists, people reading other authors and reacting and so forth, and Tolkien does fall into that. He was aware of other books, he had criticism of certain aspects of, say, The Worm of Ouroboros and things like that, and he tried to do better and so forth. Also, perfect. A third argument here, and this I think is the most powerful one. J.R.R. Tolkien tried to create mythology. There's that quote about, a mythology for England. I'm not going down the full-on road, but he saw his writing certainly in the tradition of myth, which is why he, took a lot of inspiration from different mythologies and so forth. And the important thing about mythology, as we have recently learned, is that mythology changes. The power of mythology is that it moves with the times. Mythology does not have an authority. mythology does not have an author. Now, obviously, we know Tolkien wrote these stories, but the myth, the core of the story moves on, and it changes with the times. It stays relevant by moving on and leaving the original author behind. That's the power of mythology. So, having recourse to the original text of J.R.R. Tolkien and trying to figure out what Tolkien wanted to say in the 1940s and 1950s for all of the future, so there will never be any change, will, at the end of the day, make Middle-earth irrelevant. And I don't think any of us wants that. So, in order to keep Middle-earth vibrant, to keep Middle-earth going, to keep fantasy as a genre going, we need to leave Tolkien behind. I'm still thankful for all the books he wrote, but, maybe it's time to let him go. It should not be a cult. It should be, well, a tradition of conversations about books, how they could stay relevant, how they could stay great. And that's why I am in favor of iconoclasm against the image, the icon of J.R.R. Tolkien. The idol must fall. But it's not the only one. See, there's other authors, and while the Tolkien cult, I would say, is the largest one, significantly largest one, other authors go in a similar direction. We like authorities. We like to venerate people for the stuff that we like. We like to be fans of authors and so forth. And there's other authors that are creating their own legacy sometimes, in a way. When Robert Jordan died and his wife and his widow hired Brandon Sanderson to finish The Wheel of Time, that's sort of the same concept. And I don't know, try criticizing The Wheel of Time if you're not a very male-presenting person. You might get into trouble. The same thing is going on with Brandon Sanderson. He has now hired a second author to write Cosmere stories, to keep the thing going, to keep the movement going. And I would argue those are, well, they are lesser cults. And they should be stamped out just as much. So at the end of the day, it's not just iconoclasm against the cult of St. John of Oxford, but what we really need is a full-on Twilight of the Idols of the fantasy world. These texts are texts, and while it is obviously helpful to ask authors while they are around what they mean, if these texts should stay relevant, if they should have a chance to stay relevant, we need to leave those authors behind at some point. And that's what I wanted to say today. All right, thanks for sticking with me so far. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. If you disagree, please let me know in the comments. If you agree, please let me know in the comments. I like praise. It helps me a lot. Like, subscribe. If you feel I deserve money, there's a Patreon or a PayPal. I do like money sometimes, even though I hate capitalism. And with all of that, thanks. And I'll see you very soon for like another video. And until then, cheers.